Imagine for a second, right, that you are running a massive multinational corporation.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But this isn't a normal company selling a product or, offering a service. You have suddenly found yourself in charge of taxing and governing millions of people.
Oh, wow. That's a pivot.
Yeah, across a vast, incredibly complex territory halfway across the world.
Yeah.
And the question immediately becomes, well, how do you extract maximum revenue to keep your shareholders back home happy?
Right, because they always want their cut.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But how do you do that without absolutely destroying the very people who are creating the wealth in the first place?
That is the million-dollar question. Or I guess the multi-million-dollar question.
Literally. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking you into a truly fascinating stack of sources to figure out how one of the most powerful organizations in history tried to answer that exact question.
Yeah, and we are looking at a really remarkable set of documents today. Specifically, we've got excerpts and appendices from the Fifth Report from the Select Committee on the Affairs of the East India Company.
A very catchy title.
Oh, yeah, rolls right off the tongue. But this massive document was presented to the British House of Commons in 1812.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack how the British East India Company struggled, and I mean like deeply, profoundly struggled, to figure out land taxes in the Madras presidency.
Which is what we know today as modern-day South India, right?
Exactly. We are going to look at how abstract, boardroom debates back in London shaped the literal daily survival of everyday farmers on the ground.
And it is so crucial to look past the surface of these documents because, I mean, they might sound like dry financial history at first glance.
Right, like old accounting ledgers.
Yeah, but the core tension here is timeless. We're really looking at the clash between top-down theoretical legal models drawn up by bureaucrats and the messy, completely unpredictable reality of human agriculture.
It's honestly a story about tyranny, sweeping reforms, clogged justice systems, and clerks who literally work themselves to death trying to make sense of a world they barely understood.
It really is.
So let's start right at ground zero. Before the British started overhauling everything, how are they actually getting the money out of the ground? Our sources mentioned something called the village system. How did that work?
Well, under that older system, the East India Company didn't actually deal with individual farmers.
No, they didn't.
No. The texts call the ryots, the everyday farmers, they were ignored by the top brass. Instead, the responsibility for collecting rent for an entire village was handed over to local headmen.
Okay, and the texts refer to them as, wait, let me check my notes, potales or grammatans.
Exactly, the potales. So the government simply gave the village a total tax bill, a lump sum, and the potales acted as the middlemen responsible for squeezing that amount out of the community.
Okay, let's unpack this, because reading the collector's reports, these headmen do not sound like, civic-minded civil servants.
Not at all.
They sound like corrupt middle managers, or honestly like local mob bosses running a protection racket.
That's a perfect comparison. They essentially operated with total impunity. I mean, the texts detail just a horrifying level of extortion.
Because the British didn't care how they got the money.
Exactly. Because the government only cared about getting the top-line revenue, they completely turned a blind eye to how the potales actually acquired it. So these headmen would force the poorer, inferior ryots to pay full rent on uncultivated, barren wastelands.
Just to make up their quotas. That's insane. And I saw a really frustrating detail in the sources about ruined crops. Like, if a farmer had a terrible season, were they just out of luck?
Well, the report introduces a term for that. It's called shavy, which refers to damaged produce or, crops ruined by drought or blight.
Right.
And under the established rules of the region, farmers were actually supposed to be forgiven for shavy.
Which makes sense. You shouldn't have to pay taxes on food that never grew.
Right, but the potales would force the farmers to pay taxes on the ruined crops anyway, and then they'd just pocket the difference. They ruthlessly oppressed the peasant class.
So wait, a farmer loses their harvest to a drought, and then the local headman kicks down their door demanding payment for phantom crops.
Yes, exactly.
That is wild.
Yeah.
And obviously, if a farmer knows that any extra effort they put into their land is just going to be stolen by the local mob boss, they have zero incentive to improve their farm.
None. Why would they?
Right. The whole economy must have been entirely stagnant.
Stagnation is exactly what the British collectors encountered when they actually went out there. A few key figures in our sources, specifically this collector, Mr. Ravenshaw, and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Monroe.
Monroe's a big name here.
Huge name. They realized this system was fundamentally broken around 1803 to 1805. They recognized that the middleman was just destroying the productive capacity of the region.
So what did Monroe and Ravenshaw actually propose to fix this? Because the report gives their idea a specific name.
Yeah, they introduced the riot war system, or riot wari, and it was a radical shift in their administrative philosophy.
Because it cut out the potails?
It entirely bypassed those oppressive headmen, yes. Under the riot war system, the government assessed rent directly on the individual cultivators.
Oh, wow. So dealing with every single farmer.
Exactly. Based on the specific piece of land they worked, they gave each farmer a document called a pata, signed by the collector, which explicitly stated their exact rent.
Like a binding receipt.
Exactly. And the pottails were demoted to mere village collectors. They were strictly prohibited from taking a single penny more than what was written on that piece of paper.
Okay, so they cut out the toxic middleman and gave the farmers some legal protection. But that must have meant lowering the overall tax burden, right?
It did.
Because if they stopped extorting people for ruined crops, the company's revenue should have dropped, at least on paper.
Well, what's fascinating here is the underlying economic philosophy that Thomas Monroe championed. He operated on what he called a great practical principle.
Which is?
To make an oppressed country flourish, assessment must first be low. Monroe argued that just one single year of overassessment could throw a region back beyond the power of several years of favorable seasons to recover.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he understood that capital accumulation at the lowest level, like letting farmers save a little money, was the actual engine of long-term wealth.
It's the idea that immediate greed actually costs you money in the long run.
Exactly.
And the sources show that Monroe was right. By lowering the tax burden, the farmers finally felt secure. They actually cultivated more land because they knew they could keep the surplus.
Right, because the potail wasn't going to steal it.
Exactly. And within a short period, the total public revenue actually exceeded previous years. The farmers were happy. The company was making more money. Everybody wins. It sounds like the perfect reform.
It really was a massive success on the ground. However,
There we go.
yeah, however, the bureaucratic machinery back in the colonial capital saw it very differently.
Right. And this is where the story takes a turn that makes absolutely zero sense to me. If the riot war system was printing money and keeping the region stable, why did the East India Company suddenly decide to pivot?
It's a great question.
Because I'm reading these sources, and they announce a switch back to what they call triennial village leases, meaning 3-year leases handed right back to those same oppressive potails they just stripped of power.
Yeah, the Board of Revenue mandated the reversal, and their justification centered entirely around the newly established British Courts of Justice.
Wait, I have to push back on the logic here. Because they documented that the headmen were tyrants. They saw revenue increase when the tyrants were bypassed. Why go backward?
I know, it sounds counterintuitive.
It feels like fixing a leaky pipe by flooding your entire house.
Yeah.
How did the new courts justify bringing back the mob bosses?
Well, the Board of Revenue claimed that running the riot war system, where the government has to deal with thousands of individual farmers directly, was, in their words, inconsistent, unsafe, and impossible to maintain alongside their new formalized legal code. Ah, so it was too much paperwork.
Exactly. Dealing with a handful of village headmen was administratively simple. Dealing with thousands of individual riots meant a mountain of paperwork and disputes.
So it was literally just an excuse to avoid administrative work.
Pretty much. It was about forcing the messy reality of Indian agriculture to fit into neat British administrative boxes. Like, if there was a dispute over rent under the riot war system, the government was directly involved with the farmer.
Right.
But under the lease system, the government just collected a lump sum from the potail. If the potail abused the farmer, the government could wipe its hands clean and say, that is a private dispute, take it to the new courts.
But taking a dispute to the new courts was a complete joke. I mean, how is a poor farmer supposed to use a British legal system?
Mechanically, it was impossible. The courts were located in central hubs, meaning a farmer might have to walk 50 miles just to file a complaint.
50 miles on foot. Right. And once there, they faced a legal system operating in a foreign language, requiring written affidavits, complex summons, and, of course, legal fees they could never afford.
Yeah, there is a quote from the collector of the Southern Division of Arcot that is just tragic. He writes about this flood of complaints he was receiving from the inhabitants who were being abused under these new 3-year leases.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And he admits, he says, I have no power to grant redress. I can only refer them to the court, And the court, if it did nothing else, would not have time to redress all such grievances.
He was completely
He
helpless.
literally says the road to justice is so clogged with forms that 9 out of 10 grievances never even come before a judge.
And this raises such an important question about the nature of massive institutions. We are looking at a government prioritizing the form of the judicial process over the actual function of justice.
That's a great way to put it. Form over function.
Right. They built these courts to project this image of the rule of law, but the process was so slow, so bureaucratic, and so detached from the reality on the ground that it functioned as a wall between the victims and their only source of protection.
They effectively abandoned the most vulnerable people to known abusers just to make their accounting and legal systems look tidy.
Exactly.
It's infuriating.
Yeah.
But reading further into the sources, the 3-year leases clearly jammed the system so badly that the higher-ups realized they needed a permanent fix because the friction was destroying the economy.
Right. The short-term leases were a disaster.
Which sparks this massive debate over a permanent settlement. What was that exactly?
Well, the prevailing wisdom among British administrators at the time was the zemindary system, which had actually already been implemented up in Bengal.
Okay, so they had a template.
Yes. The idea was to create a class of permanent landlords, the zemindars. They would own vast tracts of land and pay a fixed tax to the company in perpetuity.
I can see why a bureaucrat sitting in an office in London would love that. It perfectly mirrors the British system of wealthy lords and sprawling estates.
Very familiar to them, yeah.
You just look at a spreadsheet, you deal with one wealthy guy who guarantees your tax revenue, and you never have to think about the thousands of peasants actually farming the dirt.
Exactly. The zemindary system offered predictability. The government wouldn't have to worry about droughts or shavy or managing thousands of those little pada contracts.
The landlord absorbs all the risk.
Right. And the company gets a guaranteed check.
So Lord William Bentinck, the governor of Madras, initially leaned toward doing exactly this right.
Yeah, he did. It seemed like the obvious solution to him.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Bentinck didn't just sit in his palace and decree that the zemindary system would be the law of the land.
No, he actually listened to his people on the ground.
Yeah. His local collectors, the guys actually out in the field, started sending him warnings. So he decides to get the facts. He sends Mr. William Thackeray, a member of the Board of Revenue, on a major investigative road trip.
A fact-finding mission.
Exactly, to places like Canara, Malabar, and the ceded districts. For the listener trying to picture this, where are these places geographically?
So Thackeray is traveling down the western coast of India. Regions like Canara and Malabar are these lush coastal strips bounded by the Arabian Sea to the west and the Western Ghats mountain range to the east.
Okay, got it.
And these regions had a very different history compared to the eastern and central plains.
Right, and what Thackeray finds there completely flips the script on the entire bureaucratic debate.
It really does. Because when Thackeray arrives in Canara, he doesn't find the poverty, the extortion, or the chaotic land disputes that plagued the areas under the Potails.
What does he find?
He finds incredible, enduring prosperity. The revenue is collected easily and regularly, and when he investigates the underlying mechanisms, he discovers that the land tax was moderate, but more importantly, individual property rights already existed.
Right. The texts point out that these property rights were ancient. Like, the farmers in Kancha didn't need artificial landlords because they already owned their land.
Exactly.
They had a hereditary right to cultivate it, sell it, pass it down. They weren't just tenants, they were proprietors.
And Thackeray observes that when a person knows their exact financial obligations to the state, and they are assured the quiet enjoyment of the surplus produce of their own labor, true encouragement to industry arises.
Basically, if you know you get to keep what you earn, you work harder.
Right. He essentially realizes that the riot war system, taxing the individual fairly and directly, isn't just a clever British invention. It was the natural historical state of prosperity in Canara before various despots tried to overwrite it.
So Thackeray writes back to Bentinck and basically says, stop trying to invent artificial landlords.
Yeah, he tells him to drop the zemindary idea.
He says, if the individual riot war system is already working and mirrors the most prosperous regions, the best thing we can do is make that permanent. Secure the individual farmer's right to their own land, keep the taxes fixed, and the country will thrive.
It is such a profound realization about statecraft. I mean, Thackeray is arguing that the state's role should be to recognize and protect organic existing rights, not to manufacture new social hierarchies purely for administrative convenience.
Right. Inserting a zemindar where one never existed naturally just adds a layer of parasites who extract value without contributing to the productivity of the land at all.
Precisely.
But the tragedy here is that we don't have to guess what happens when the government ignores this advice, because the sources provide a glaring cautionary tale in the province of Dindigul,
Oh, Dindigul! Yes.
where they forced the zemindary system anyway.
Yeah, the Dindigul disaster perfectly illustrates the catastrophic dangers of theoretical policy colliding with ground-level economic reality.
So they introduced the permanent zemindary settlements there, but the way they calculated the tax was just absurd.
How so?
Well, they based the permanent tax rate on an ultimate survey rent, meaning they taxed the land based on what they aggressively speculated it might be worth in the future, not what it was actually producing right then.
Oh, wow. So they overvalued it immediately.
Massively.
No.
And because the assessment was impossibly high, the original native headmen of the region refused to sign the contracts. They knew the land couldn't produce that much wealth. So who steps in to buy these newly created permanent estates?
Opportunists, I'm guessing.
Exactly. It's exactly like a modern corporate buyout funded by predatory debt. You have these ignorant speculators pouring in from the cities. They have no actual capital of their own, but they buy the estates on credit, hoping they can squeeze the farmers harder than anyone else ever has.
And how does that actually play out economically for the region?
It totally collapses. I mean, the farmers can't produce the impossible yields. The speculators squeeze them, so the farmers flee or just starve. Then the speculators default on their massive tax bills to the company. The estates are seized and resold to cover the balances, and the cycle just repeats.
Wow.
The sources say that for 3 years in a row, the entire system failed extensively.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the court of directors back in London eventually had to address this systemic failure.
They couldn't ignore it forever.
Right. They sent a very sharp warning to Madras, observing that exorbitant imposts don't just fail to raise money. The true danger is that they alienate the landholders, shake public confidence in the government, and render the entire administration unpopular.
Yeah, by trying to extract maximum theoretical value, they effectively incapacitated the productive capital of the whole country.
You can't squeeze blood from a stone.
And if you keep trying, you just break the stone. And, we have to recognize that the East India Company wasn't just taxing dirt. Realizing that the EIC had their hands in everything raises a massive logistical question.
Because it wasn't just land.
Right. Our sources detail these massive non-land monopolies.
Yeah, the breadth of the East India Company's economic extraction was just staggering. I mean, the reports detail strict monopolies on the manufacture and sale of salt. They heavily taxed inland trade simply for goods transiting through the country.
Wow.
They licensed the sale of tobacco and betel, the leaf commonly chewed across South Asia.
They even rented out the pearl and shank fisheries on the coasts of Tinnevelly and Ramnad. Just imagine the sheer logistics of that.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
An organization headquartered in a damp office building in London is somehow claiming a percentage of the value of a pearl dragged off the ocean floor by a diver in South India. They had their hands in literally every pocket of the economy.
You really did.
Which brings up a horrifying thought. In 1812, without computers, without Excel, without instantaneous communication, how on earth did London actually track these thousands of microtransactions?
Well, the physical toll of this bureaucracy on the people managing it is an often overlooked tragedy in these texts. The appendices of this report give us a glimpse into the intense manual labor required to compile this history.
Right.
There are a few figures the text literally refers to as giants. Let's look at Mr. James Cumming.
Yeah, James Cumming was a senior clerk at the Board of Control and an official friend of Thomas Monroe.
Right.
He was the one primarily responsible for sifting through mountains of handwritten ledgers shipped across the ocean over 6-month voyages just to draft this monumental fifth report.
And Cumming was the one who forced the government to actually look at the hard data. He took the public completely by surprise with the perfection of the system he drew up.
He basically showed them the receipts.
Exactly. He stripped away the dream of optimism that the public authorities had been living in regarding their Indian revenues. He quantified the failures like Dindigul and the successes like Kanara.
But the cost to him was absolute.
Yeah.
The text says he devoted himself so unremittingly to the discharge of his public duties that he died a martyr to his zeal and exertions.
He worked himself to death.
He literally worked himself into an early grave, compiling this data by hand. And he wasn't the only giant. The appendix introduces us to Sir Charles Wilkins.
Yes, Wilkins. His contribution to this apparatus is entirely different, but equally staggering. He is the man who wrote the glossary for the report.
Right, which was deemed so essential for understanding the foreign terminology that Parliament actually ordered it reprinted in 1813.
But Wilkins was not just a bureaucrat making a dictionary.
No.
He arrived in Bengal in 1770, mastered Bengali, Persian, and eventually Sanskrit. He was actually the first person to translate the Bhagavad Gita into English.
Which is incredible on its own. But the part of the story that blew my mind is about the typography.
Oh, the printing presses?
Yes. When he couldn't find a printer in Europe with the right typefaces to print these vernacular languages, what did he do?
Well, he was forced to bridge the technological gap himself. The text notes that he was obliged to charge himself with all the various occupations of the metallurgist, the engraver, the founder, and the printer.
Wait, so he made the metal letters?
He literally smelted the metal to cast his own Bengali and Persian founts of type. He translated sacred ancient texts and then personally built the physical machinery required to mass produce them.
That is the definition of a giant. Translating a language is one thing. Becoming a blacksmith so you can print it is just another level of dedication.
It really is.
But much like Cumming, the sources note that ill health compelled him to abandon his work and return to England. These men poured their entire lives and their physical health into trying to codify a civilization that was entirely foreign to them.
So what does this all mean, taking a step back?
Yeah, let's summarize. We've traced a remarkable arc today. We started with the brutal extortion of the village headmen and the potails. We saw the promise of the riot war reforms.
Right, the realization that low taxes and direct engagement actually fuel prosperity.
Exactly. Then we witnessed the tragic reversal, where bureaucrats abandoned the farmers to a hopelessly clogged legal system just to simplify their own paperwork.
Form over function.
Always. We followed Thackeray down the coast to Canada to discover that ancient permanent property rights were the true engine of wealth. We dissected the catastrophic failure in Dindigul when the government tried to invent a speculative landlord class out of thin air.
And finally, we looked at the literal blood, sweat, and hand-cast typefaces poured into documenting this massive corporate empire by men like Cumming and Wilkins.
Yeah, so if we bring this all back to you, the listener, it's worth asking why a deep dive into an 1812 colonial tax report matters to your life today.
Well, it matters deeply because the fundamental dynamic of large institutions hasn't changed at all. Whenever a massive organization, whether it is a 19th century colonial government or a 21st century global tech monopoly, tries to optimize for efficiency or neatness on a spreadsheet, they run the terrible risk of ignoring the actual lived reality of the individuals at the bottom.
Right.
When you prioritize the form of the system over the function it serves, it almost always leads to systemic failure.
And the East India Company struggled to understand their subjects because data traveled at the speed of a sailing ship, right? Every scrap of information had to be gathered by hand, debated in letters, and compiled by men working themselves to death in dimly lit rooms.
That was a bottleneck.
But today, the massive corporations and governments governing our lives have instantaneous granular data on every single one of us. They know our habits, our finances, our movements. So here's a final thought for you to mull over. Does having perfect instant data actually make a massive system more humane? Or does it just make it that much easier for modern bureaucrats to overassess and extract value from us without us even noticing?